Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: a huge fire at an apartment complex in Hong Kong continues into its second day, with the death toll rising to 83, and nearly 300 people are still unaccounted for. Who's being held accountable?
My daughter and my husband are still not out.
The Pentagon is pushing to add Chinese tech giant Alibaba to its list of companies aiding China's military, and U.S. customer data could be at risk. What does this mean for national security? NTD breaks it down with a panel of experts.
It is a total unrestricted warfare against the United States, so financial, cyber, and tech are part of that.
A huge fire in Hong Kong still going on. On the second day, firefighters continued extinguishing fires that engulfed an apartment complex more than 24 hours after the blaze began. At a Thursday press conference, authorities say the death toll had risen to at least 83, with more than 250 people still unaccounted for.
Actually, our major challenge is the temperature is very high in the fire ground. And the inside layout is very complex because the scaffolding is collapsed. And our firefighter need to conference the high temperature to proceed to the fire ground one layer by one layer.
Authorities earlier said that in addition to the buildings being covered with protective mesh sheets and plastic that did not meet fire standards, they discovered in one unaffected building that windows were sealed with foam material installed by a construction company carrying out maintenance work. Eileen Chung is a senior superintendent with the Hong Kong Police.
We do not rule out the possibility that these foam materials contributed to the rapid spread of the fire. We have reason to believe that the company's responsible parties were grossly negligent, which led to this accident and caused the fire to spread uncontrollably, resulting in major casualties.
The police have arrested 3 men from the construction firm on suspicion of manslaughter. Meantime, residents of the apartment complex are mourning the loss of their homes.
We bought this apartment more than 20 years ago. All of our belongings were in this apartment. And now that it is all burned like this, what's left? There's nothing left. What are we supposed to do? What we hope most is that the government will help us solve this problem. We don't have any other requests, just a hope that the government can help us resolve it.
Other residents are concerned about how authorities handled evacuations.
The firemen could have put out the smaller fire on our block and saved everyone inside first. My block is still on fire now. My daughter and my husband are still not out. The husband of my neighbor has already died.
Hong Kong is among the most densely populated places in the world and also among the world's most expensive housing markets. Wang Fuk Court is one of many high-rise housing complexes under the government-subsidized home ownership scheme. It has 2,000 apartments in 8 blocks that are home to more than 4,600 people in a city struggling with a chronic shortage of affordable housing.
Chinese tech giant Alibaba is under scrutiny from the Pentagon for providing tech support and sensitive customer data to China's military. On Thursday, the Pentagon recommended adding Alibaba Group to its list of companies aiding the Chinese military. The Financial Times first reported in October that Alibaba collects U.S. sensitive customer data, including IP addresses and Wi-Fi data. What does this mean for U.S. national security and the broader tech landscape? Joining NTD's Carrie Duns to unpack the situation are Daniel Cochrane, a senior research associate at the Heritage Foundation, and host of China Insider, David Zhang. Take a look.
Alibaba is one of China's largest tech companies. They provide both cloud services, so similar to Amazon here in the United States. They allow for companies and individuals to essentially host data and also engage in various compute functions via servers that they host. Now, the problem is they're also providing AI tools. They provide significant AI LLMs, and those LLMs are being utilized by the Chinese military against American interests, as the memo highlighted. This is really an interesting development because we've also seen similar things happen with American companies. So specifically, Anthropic here in the United States recently disrupted attempts by Chinese state actors to use their agentic AI Claude against high-level American targets, including financial institutions, chemical companies, even government targets. We also know that TikTok has long been collecting Americans' data, and that companies like Alibaba and TikTok have an obligation under Chinese law to participate with the CCP to target Americans and to profile us. It's a really concerning threat to our national security and our sovereignty.
Yeah, you bring up a couple great points there. And one, obviously, we saw TikTok getting transferred to U.S. ownership, but Alibaba, which about 20% of online shoppers say that they go to Alibaba, so its scale is quite significant in the U.S. And David, of course, Alibaba now has denied these accusations that they have any cooperation with the Chinese military, but in Washington, they're not so convinced. So how deeply integrated, in your understanding, is Alibaba with the Chinese state and their military capacity?
So from the very beginning, the management behind Alibaba had to grow the company through the influence of the Chinese regime. So they've been sort of tied together in the very beginning. But obviously, there's also data laws and security laws in China that mandates that Chinese companies, especially tech companies, should they require their data, they have to share it with the Chinese government. But also think about what the interest of the Chinese government and its companies really have. It is a total unrestricted warfare against the United States. So financial, cyber, and tech are part of that. And so combining all of this, you really see what's essentially an agenda to compete against American companies, but also at the same time provide something called a civil-military fusion, which essentially there's no real distinctions between a civilian company or a military company.
Daniel, over to you. What are the legal and then ethical risks for U.S. companies who do want to engage with Chinese tech giants like Alibaba for commercial interests?
The risks have never been higher, both from an ethical and national security standpoint. Look, especially when you're putting your data on their servers, we had this with TikTok too. All that data is stored in servers in China. It's accessible at any time by the companies or the governments. And as David mentioned, there really isn't a separation between the companies and the military. It's all integrated. Every company is a potential weapon of the Chinese Communist Party. And we know that they've been very clear. Their goal is to use the best technologies out there, specifically AI, to perpetrate attacks against American targets. That includes crippling our critical infrastructure. It includes, as an example, hacking systems like the system behind our flights here in the United States, the aircraft here in the United States, which can really create delays and huge problems for our economy.
And David, we know that China has been aggressively pursuing AI and tech innovations. Daniel was talking about those large language models, which really are the underpinnings of how AI functions. So does Alibaba fit into China's broader strategy to advance this technological and military fusion that you had been describing earlier?
Yeah, so really, for the average, it's really hard to understand how data can be weaponized. And the key here isn't necessarily tomorrow they're going to come into your front door and demand certain things from you, but it is a building up through these machine learning and now essentially AI functional models that create almost like a strategic plan, assessments, or even a plan of attacks against a certain interest in the United States. For example, it could be the intelligence community. It could be your power grid or infrastructure, water lines. Anything specifically that they can do to cripple the system, to cause fear, and to demand even sort of a ransom out of those attacks, or to simply temporarily shut down certain things can be done. But also with data specifically, this is where it gets really tricky because it's almost like they know more about us than we do about them. And so in warfare, a lot of times, it's really about knowing your enemy.
Yeah, you're talking about this use of this sensitive data, maybe one data piece in isolation, not that meaningful, but when there's data points that can be triangulated and then use those AI tools to then do things at scale. It can be activated, and it is a vulnerability. To that point, Daniel, with Alibaba's AI capabilities, what security threats do you think it poses to the U.S. specifically?
Yeah, well, actually picking up on David's point, I think it's critical to understand. And as you said, look, you can take with AI, you can take a bunch of seemingly disparate data points and link them together, because AI is fundamentally a pattern recognition technology. It's very good at taking disparate pieces of data and then creating digital profiles, figuring out what your vulnerabilities are, whether it's at an individual level or an institutional or even at a governmental level. And finding those vulnerabilities is of high value to the Chinese. But in addition to that, and going beyond the sort of the pattern recognition and the uncovering of vulnerabilities that AI can provide and is to the Chinese, it's also giving them advanced cyber hacking capabilities. And we know this because the Chinese are using, and I mentioned Anthropic, which is an American company, and they disrupted this attempt, but it was an attempt by Chinese actors to use advanced LLM capabilities to hack basically American critical infrastructure. I believe there was something like over 30 targets. So we know that they're using the AI not just to parse data, but also to perpetrate attacks on our critical infrastructure. So it's sort of that two-part challenge. But I'll add a third element, and we saw this with TikTok. And the reality is that the Chinese still control enormous amounts of our tech stack, other applications like Temu. And we know, for example, that TikTok's algorithm was designed to surface the most toxic content. That is a strategy to rend America's social fabric. So AI in that context, in the context of say AI chatbots, could be used strategically by the Chinese to disrupt America's social fabric. That's just as effective in some way as hacking our critical infrastructure, and it's far more diffuse and harder to combat.
So David, as we start to wrap up, I'd just like to get some understandings of different other use cases that the CCP might be trying to, mix these data sets, consumer data sets, with military objectives, with sort of PR or publicity type objectives that serve its greater goals.
One additional one I think worth for us to know is market caps, right? Because the more that you see Chinese products, the more that you see Chinese content, the more you see things coming out of China being in, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, the more reliance you create. When you have reliance, it's a long-term dependence on something that you really cannot get rid of. For example, with the 5G infrastructure or the 4G infrastructures in the United States, it's taking the country a very long time to replace and swap out those equipments. And those equipments, when they're in place, you rely on them for the communications, but also they provide those surveillance capabilities and potentially spying on, say, a key military base nearby. So it just shows you that once you get these things into the system, it takes a long time for them to go away. With the digital fentanyl like TikTok, that goes a step further. It's implanted into a teenager's brain for certain types of algorithm-based content that they like or desire. So it's almost like you're creating a base for relying on things coming out of China that eventually serve a very harmful long-term effect to those in America and other countries as well.
Yeah, if the term digital fentanyl doesn't set off alarm bells, then you really are asleep at the wheel. Such a fascinating and important conversation. Daniel Cochran, David Zhang, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks.
Coming up, what makes the U.S. different from communist China? How does communism rely on one crisis to reset another? And how stable is the communist regime now? Gregory Copley joins us to delve into these topics in his new book, The Noble State: Governance Options in an Ignoble Era.
So if the Communist Party is going to survive Xi, first they have to discredit him, put him behind them, and then come up with a new approach to reviving the economy and the social cohesion and loyalty of the population. That's going to be almost impossible to do, as the Soviet Union found out. They're going to have to literally abandon communism.
More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. This Thanksgiving, we take a moment to reflect on the different forms of governance. What's the difference between globalization and globalism? And how does communism rely on one crisis to reset another? How does a nation's prestige act as a deterrent? We sat down with Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association, to delve into these topics in his new book, The Noble State: Governance Options in an Ignoble Era. Gregory Copley, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Wonderful to be with you again, Tiffany.
I want to tap into the Chinese regime part because it's kind of interesting. You know, you have communism come in, Marxism, and it's a rejection of traditions. You saw that play out with the Cultural Revolution, right? All these different aspects, a very atheistic society, which in its own way you could argue is a religion. You have to believe in the party. But then you also hear people like Xi Jinping come up with phrases like, oh, mandate of heaven, which heralds back to a previous time and previous way of governance. So it sounds like, to your point, you still need that symbolism or something that people can look up to, even in a society like that says it has total control. But in addition to that, we are also seeing, if you will, this rise in globalism, especially from regimes like the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to talking at the UN, World Economic Forum, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of pushing its own form of governance on the global scale. So you have a globalism as a form of governance, if you will, but then there's also the trend of globalization, the intermingling of markets and stuff. And it seems almost there's a conflation of the two now, where a lot of other governments around the world are also pushing for globalism under the guise of globalization. Could you talk about that for us and, how that fits in with what we're seeing play out in terms of the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, well, globalism is an ideology, whereas globalization, as you say, is the interplay of markets around the world. There is a relationship, because what we've seen in the rise, if you like, of globalization, we saw literally harmony come to the world through international trade and the sharing of resources and the like. But the globalism concept is really the concept, if you like, of transnational governance. In other words, it's the abandonment of societies, it's the abandonment of identity and sovereignty, or supposedly. But what we see with all of these totalitarian globalist movements, as we've seen them through history, particularly fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, Soviet communism and Chinese communism and so on, they have been all globalist totalitarian movements where they depended for their survival on a rolling momentum, continuing victories over other countries and other peoples, so that you keep absorbing them. And one of the things about these totalitarian globalist movements is that as soon as they start to stumble and run out of steam, they collapse. We saw that with the Italians and the fascists and the German Nazis movements. They were both defeated militarily, so that's how they basically run out of steam. With the Soviet Union, it ran out of steam because of the ideology wasn't sustainable. So it literally went from one crisis and reset to another, as we've been seeing in China. And you see the death of Stalin. The only way to revive the society there was for Khrushchev to make his big 4-hour speech in February 1956, in which he blamed it all on Stalin. And really, used that as the excuse to say, well, going forward, we're going to be much better. And of course, because they didn't have any new ideology or any new great insights to offer, the society ultimately collapsed in 1990. We're seeing the same thing now, today, in fact, in the People's Republic of China. Now, Xi Jinping came into office, if you like, blaming his predecessors and saying he was going to restore true Marxist-Leninist, Maoist philosophy. And all he did was, as the Soviets did, he kept applying ideas and ideologies which didn't work. And we've now reached the terminal stage, if you like, of Xi's society, where things just don't work. So if the Communist Party is going to survive Xi, first they have to discredit him, put him behind them, and then come up with a new approach to reviving the economy and the social cohesion and loyalty of the population. that's going to be almost impossible to do, as the Soviet Union found out. They're going to have to literally abandon communism. And the People's Republic of China going to fragment as people scramble for survival. What is the Western countries going to do? What's the United States going to do? Is it going to attempt to stabilize that part of China which produces, if you like, and processes rare earth minerals in Mongolia, and then create a safe corridor down to the seaports in northern China so that they can get to the world markets? All of these questions come up, but it's all part of this greater picture of saying, well, okay, things are falling apart. What do we really want to see emerge out of this in 10 years' time, 20 years' time? Because we're going to see 10 or 20 years of chaos.
I think we've covered on nobility and a couple other uniting aspects, but there's another part that was super interesting. You're citing your colleague, Dr. Stefan Pisoni, who remarked that prestige is the credit rating of nations. I think that fits into a lot of different aspects, especially like the strength of a society and a community. But how does that fit in with something like deterrence on a more global scale?
Well, prestige equates to deterrence very much. If you have prestige, you don't have to use your armed forces. Your armed forces have to look credible and have to be seen to be able to perform. And that's what the United States and Britain and so on did very, very well over the past few centuries. They had an ability to follow through on their threats and promises. They could, in fact, enforce. So the advantage of having prestige coupled with military force is that you don't have to use that military force. You go into negotiations, people listen, and we see that when you lose prestige, the value of your currency declines, the threat of your armed forces declines. Look at the United States in the last 20 years or so, or 30 years. We've seen massive decline in prestige of the United States since the government of, say, Ronald Reagan, until we started to see President Trump reasserting real US action. Now, the United States has gained massively in credibility, not yet so in terms of absolute prestige. That because prestige takes decades and generations to build. But the United States at least is seen to be being aggressive in posturing its national interests and looking after it, the strength of its borders, the strength of its currency, the ability to project its power around the world. So that will pay off. What we've seen in the People's Republic of China is the exact opposite. The last 5 to 10 years have seen an absolute collapse in the prestige of the Chinese currency, the yuan or renminbi. We've seen an absolute collapse in the credibility of the government because it says one thing and does another. It threatens its partners. It doesn't rely on inherent prestige. It bullies people into doing what they want.
It's been a very fascinating conversation. We have so much more to dig into in your book, but Gregory Copley, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tiffany.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For On the Clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching, and from all of us here at China in Focus, happy Thanksgiving.